Berlin in the 1950s and early 60s, and I, in fact, was born there. In fact, in 1960, and my dad noted that the Berlin Wall was put up a year later, which he didn't think was a coincidence, but I didn't take that too personally. Okay, are you seeing the next slide now? Black Friday?
We're still seeing the first slide.
Okay. How's that? Okay.
Yeah, we can see the second slide now.
Okay, great, thank you. And you can see the entire, is it taking up the entire picture now? Or do you see the?
It's all set.
Okay. I think it's helpful to understand some of the context of what was going on in Europe, United States in the early 1950s. A lot of the sort of superpower status that the United States had emerged from World War II with was kind of being eroded in terms of some of the technological advantages we had. The Soviets had exploded their own hydrogen bomb in 1951. That was on the heels of an atomic bomb in 1949. And the Soviets had managed to also detect that the Americans were stealing a lot of their secrets. And so they changed their methods for communicating. They had been doing a lot of radio communication, and the Americans had been able to intercept that and decrypt the communications. But they were tipped off by Kim Philby, a fairly notorious British spy, and also a spy in the American, in the US Army Security Agency, tipped them off about this American operation known as Venona. And after they changed their communications, this became known as Black Friday, because we were suddenly without any good intelligence about what the Soviets were up to. And this was at a time when Cold War tensions were really increasing. And one result was when the North Korea launched a surprise attack into the South in 1950. We had no advance warning. We also were greatly outnumbered by the Soviets in terms of conventional troops that had been left in Europe after World War II ended. And the Red Army was poised in East Germany, in Czechoslovakia and Poland, some 400,000 strong armored units who were well equipped. Much of that force was poised along the borders with Western Europe. And President Eisenhower comes into office in 1952, and he's pretty dismayed at the lack of good intelligence we have. The CIA hasn't been able to really penetrate behind the Iron Curtain. You know, any attempt we had putting agents behind, into Soviet territory ended pretty badly. A lot of these agents were quickly rolled up. It's also really important to remember that this is before the U-2 was flying. There certainly were no satellites with the overhead imagery. And the NSA wasn't really having much luck either. It was a young organization, and they were just able to intercept some communications along the periphery of the Soviet Union, down in Turkey and a few places like that. So Eisenhower became concerned that we were entering a dangerous phase of the Cold War, essentially blind. Winston Churchill had come back to power in that time frame too, and Churchill was also concerned, and they agreed they wanted to work together to try to figure out a solution. So let's see. This map from the book kind of gives you an idea of why Berlin was chosen for an operation like this. Of course, Berlin was a divided city at that point into four sectors: Soviet, American, British, and French. But it's also important to remember that this is before the Berlin Wall had been built. So there's actually free flow of people, information across the sector borders. And at the same time, Berlin is of course in the middle of what was East Germany. And so this was really our best looking point into the Iron Curtain. And Berlin was also the center of communications for really all of Europe, certainly connecting Western Europe with Eastern, Central Europe, and Moscow itself. A lot of the old communication lines from the times of, the Kaiser, all the roads, all the communication lines led into Berlin, and then Berlin was sort of like the center of the hub, and all the spokes went out to various countries across Europe. And the Soviets had the Red Army headquarters for the group of Soviet forces in Germany were based in and around Berlin. So that also made it extremely important as a communication center. The idea for doing something to tap into Soviet communications came from these two gentlemen with the CIA. Bill Harvey on the right, who's sort of a legendary case officer and Berlin base chief in the 1950s. Really hard driving guy. He's a former FBI agent who had had quite a bit of success during World War II, chasing Nazi spies in America, and he'd broken up a couple of Nazi rings. He'd been fired by J. Edgar Hoover for various acts of insubordination, and also there was the time that he fell asleep in Rock Creek Park after having too many beers, and he failed to check in with his superiors to let them know his whereabouts because he was sleeping it off in the park. But so he left the FBI under a bit of a cloud, but the CIA was only too eager to hire him because they were a new agency. They'd only been formed out of the National Security Act in 1947, and they didn't have anybody with Bill Harvey's counterintelligence skills, and he was very formidable in that respect. He had this mind that was kind of like a computer in a way, in that he could remember all kinds of disparate pieces of information, some passing reference that he'd seen in a file years before, and suddenly make a connection with, some puzzle that he was trying to figure out now. And it was Harvey, in fact, who put together various pieces like that and figured out that Kim Philby was a spy. And he's the one who wrote a memo to the head of the CIA, warning him about Philby, and Philby was pulled out of America at that point and fell under quite a bit of suspicion, although he would never actually be charged. Bill Harvey hooks up with Frank Rowlett, who was one of the code breakers from World War II. He was the guy who helped lead the effort to break the Japanese Purple Code, which were the diplomatic codes, and he had left the NSA and joined the Central Intelligence Agency about the same time, and the two of them were very frustrated at the lack of information they were getting about the Soviet Union, and they began thinking in terms of a tunnel in Berlin that could tap into Soviet communications. Now, where'd they get that idea? It was really a British concept. The British had done this in Vienna in the previous several years, and they had very successfully tapped Red Army communications with a series of very short tunnels. The Soviet communications in Vienna traveled into the western sectors of Vienna, which was also a divided city. And Peter Lunn, the fellow on the right, who has been the British station chief in Vienna, had come up with this plan for tapping into the Soviet cables. He was also an excellent skier. He'd been the captain of the British ski team at the 1936 Winter Olympics in Garmisch in Germany. So, he's kind of maybe a bit of a model for James Bond. Although it's funny, Bill Harvey would also be called a model for James Bond, but that was more in terms of the number of martinis that he consumed, and less for his physique. In any event, Peter Lunn was really eager to try to do this tunnel operation in Berlin as well, because Berlin would be the mother lode of Soviet communications. It would have the possibilities of access to so much information about what the capabilities and intentions of the Red Army forces based in Germany were. So they agreed to work together, Peter Lunn and Bill Harvey. Harvey is sent to Berlin about the same time as Peter Lunn. So in 1953, they are both in Berlin, actively working on this project, which is entirely close hold. Harvey's number one deputy doesn't know anything about the tunnel. This is going to be a very secret operation. The one downside about bringing in or working with the British is that it brings George Blake into the project. George Blake, who many of you might have read the obituaries about him, as he only died a few months ago at the age of 97. One of the really most damaging spies of the 20th century, in my opinion. I was able to interview him a couple times about this operation and his involvement in that. But he had already led a bit of a storybook life at this point. He had been born in Holland. His father was Turkish Sephardic Jew who became a British citizen. He fought for the British in World War I, and then he met a Dutch woman at the end of the war, and they married. And George Blake was their son. And Blake had worked for the Dutch underground after the Nazis invaded Holland, and he had served as a schoolboy courier, peddling around Holland, delivering messages, and then fearing that the Gestapo would arrest him because he was not only carry a British passport because of his father, but also because of his Jewish heritage. So he had to escape across Europe, crosses the Pyrenees into Spain in a snowstorm, and makes his way to England and joins the Royal Navy, is quickly recruited into the British Secret Intelligence Service, and had been sent to Korea on the eve of the war, and had been taken prisoner by the North Koreans and tried to escape. But then at some point during his 3-year captivity, changes sides, and he's welcomed home back to England in 1953 as a hero, but unknown to his superiors at British intelligence, he has agreed to spy for the KGB. And Blake becomes one of the very few people who know anything about this tunnel, because he's assigned to the office that is going to be overseeing the tunnel operation from the British side. So the British had the expertise to do a tap like this based on their Vienna experience. They had the people with the actual technical capabilities of placing taps on large scale, heavily used circuits. The Americans had more of the money in the budget to fund an operation like this, because this would be quite expensive. So meantime, 1953-54, the CIA is working try to figure out where would be a good site in Berlin for this tunnel. Where could they go to reach Soviet communication lines without having to travel too far underground? And these were a couple of the CIA officers who were involved with it. Hugh Montgomery, who was at the start of a CIA career at that point. He'd actually served with the OSS during World War II, had parachuted into Normandy, and spoke 8 languages. He was described as a Harvard PhD who you'd want on your side in a bar fight. So he was a pretty handy guy, very smart. He would have a legendary CIA career as well. And in fact, he only died a couple of years ago, and he was extremely helpful in my research and guiding me on to some sources to talk to. He and Alan Conway, who was a communications specialist for the CIA based in Frankfurt, um, had managed to penetrate the East German telecommunications ministry, which oversaw the cables, the telephone cables in Berlin. And they'd recruited, Montgomery had recruited a number of agents who were able to give them, the Americans, diagrams showing where the different telephone lines used by the Soviets ran and who used them. Very detailed information. So based on that information, the Americans soon zero in on these cables that you see on the right, which are run in the very southern part of Berlin, right on the border between the American sector and the Soviet sector. This was about one of the closest points where the cables came to the Western sectors. And these cables were the ones that the Red Army headquarters was using. And the Americans, and joined by the British, agreed that this rather rural part of Berlin would be the best point to try to dig a tunnel to reach the cables. And so they came up with this idea of building a U.S. Army warehouse, the U.S. installation that you see there, as a cover for the tunnel. They would build the warehouse first, and then they could hide all the equipment in the warehouse and also hide all the fill, all the dirt that they're going to have to dig. This is going to be a quarter-mile long. So this tunnel is going to be longer than, say, the Empire State Building is high, and they're going to have to put all this dirt somewhere, and it's going to have to be done in secret and also in silence. They couldn't use any heavy equipment to do this. So the tunnel site is chosen, and let's see, oops, we skipped one there. This is the warehouse that the Americans built, and you can see this overhead image with the dotted line that shows the tunnel route. So as I mentioned, this is a pretty rural part of Berlin, both the western sector, Rudau, and the village of Altklinika in East Germany, East Berlin, which was a kind of a farming community with windmills and ducks walking around in the streets. And the warehouse that the Americans built looked kind of odd, and they stuck a bunch of strange looking antenna on the top because they wanted to provide additional cover to this operation. So they gave it the look of a radar station that would be monitoring Soviet and East German aircraft flying into the nearby Schönefeld airfield that the Soviets made heavy use of. And in fact, it was an actual active radar station. They brought in signal service soldiers to run the equipment. And these soldiers didn't know anything, most of them anyway, didn't know anything about the tunnel that was being dug below them. So it was very compartmentalized how they were doing this. These are the some of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers folks who were brought in to dig the tunnel. The CIA is not going to be able to dig this tunnel themselves. They turn to the Corps of Engineers, and the two officers you see on the left and the right, Bob Williamson and Keith Comstock, were at the time young captains who were put in charge of the two of the three digging teams. And I was able to interview the two of them about this operation. They were recruited without being told where this tunnel was going to be built. All they were told was that you're going to have to dig a tunnel. It's going to be done in secret, and it's highly classified. And they chose the men that had secret clearances to do the digging. And in September of 1954, they got to work using essentially just entrenching tools, the handheld shovels that GIs would carry. And you can see this photograph of the tunnel construction in place. There was room for about 2 or 3 soldiers at the front to the head of the face of the tunnel where they're digging to excavate and fill sandbags with this fill And then they built this little railroad in the tunnel, the portions that they dug as they went along, with wooden rails and being pulled by electric, a forklift with an electric motor that could bring the fill back to the warehouse where it was being stored inside the warehouse. It was they had observers who were watching from above in the warehouse. They were watching the East Germans who were watching them. You know, the East German Vopos, as they were known, were, you know, watching the antenna on the roof, and they didn't know that there was a tunnel being dug below their feet, which kind of cracked up the GIs who were observing them from the warehouse. But it was one of these, you know, cat and mouse games that was going on. This is the farmer who farmed the land underneath which the tunnel was being dug. He was planting an orchard that year. In fact, a number of cherry and apple trees, also potatoes. And I interviewed his daughter, and she remembered that once or twice her father would hear some strange noises, and it sounded like you know, maybe a pump. But he thought it was coming from the warehouse. But what it was that the Americans had struck water down below, and also they had to tunnel through a septic field, so they had a pump going to remove the water and such. And Farmer Nowak was also kind of wondering why some of his trees weren't doing that well, but they tended to die in certain areas where the digging was going on. But anyway, they dug along for 6 months, and this is what it looked like. Oops, sorry about that. This computer's acting a little funny. Here we go. They had sandbags lining the side of the tunnel also to muffle some of the sound. And then directly below the cables, which ran underneath the highway in the East Berlin side, they had to put an equipment chamber with amplifiers. This was actually something that the Brits would be in charge of putting together. So after 6 months of digging, the Americans, the Corps of Engineer guys, they finish. They are flown back to the United States almost immediately. They don't even know what's going to happen. They don't know that the British are coming in to do the tap, because again, everything's being compartmentalized. So the Brits come in with their technicians, and they put in all these amplifiers directly below the cables. This is about a quarter mile inside the East German territory here. And they needed the amplifiers there because in order to tap the cables without the Soviets detecting it, they would have to draw such low ampage off of the cables that the sounds, the conversations, the teletype would all have to be amplified greatly in order to travel back a quarter mile to the American warehouse, which had been set up as the listening post with 150 big Ampex recorders. These are some of the British folks who were involved in tunneling up to reach the actual cables and overseeing the tap itself. The fellow sort of lying down on the right there is John Wyke, who was a major with the Secret Intelligence Service, and he was a veteran of the Vienna operation as well. Peter Montagnon below, who I interviewed in France, was an SIS officer also involved in the Vienna operation, who was down there as they placed these taps. So this was in the spring of 1955. They had reached these 3 trunk lines, which carried the bulk of the Soviet military communications. And Peter here was underneath with them. They're only 27 inches below the surface where these cables are running, and there's lots of heavy trucks and so forth running on the road above them. And Peter was quite fearful that a Soviet battle tank would come along and collapse the whole thing. But they made it unscathed, but it was a fairly dicey for a number of hours there as they worked on the taps. So in May of 1955, they actually place successfully tapped the first of the 3 cables. And this schematic from the book kind of shows how it all works. You can see here's the equipment chamber with the amplifiers, and they had to tunnel up to reach the cables here. And then once the tap is placed, it travels back along the tunnel back to the American warehouse. The Americans and the British had a listening team with the recorders. They had 150 recorders that were going almost full time. I mean, the number of conversations that are being captured here, we're not talking about 1 or 2 officers. This is sort of industrial scale tapping that had never been attempted before. And they're capturing 1,000+ conversations a day, teletype as well as voice communications. And then above them, the signal soldiers are operating the radar equipment. And again, not knowing about the tunnel below. These are some of the folks who worked inside the warehouse, taking care of the tapes. And the fellow on the left, Eugene Craig, he's lives out in New Mexico now. He was just a 19-year-old kid at the time. He was actually a really good Russian speaker, and he was also a really good singer. And so he was happy. He was singing in the Russian, in the U.S. Army Russian language choir or course out at Monterey, where they had a language school. And he suddenly got orders to report to Berlin because the amount of communications that they were intercepting was beyond what anybody had anticipated. And they needed more translators at the site to listen to what's going on, because they're looking for any kind of indication that the Soviets might be planning an attack, or as Eisenhower feared the most, a nuclear Pearl Harbor. And the Berlin Tunnel was essentially Eisenhower's assurances that that wasn't happening. They didn't detect any type of Soviet mobilization for either a ground invasion or nuclear attack. So that was a huge relief at that time. Now the tapes are being shipped out by the truckload. The British are taking the voice tapes back in London, where there's several hundred translators and analysts working in this nice looking building at Chester Terrace in London. The teletype is sent back to Washington in one of the old temporary quote unquote buildings that were built along the mall during World War I, and then again during World War II. They used one of those buildings to process this enormous amount of tape that's coming in, and the floors in this temporary building are sagging under the weight of all these tapes. So they're afraid the whole thing was going to fall apart. But there they have several hundred folks working as well, CIA translators, analysts. They brought folks in from the military services to help with this as well. And they don't know where these communications are coming from. They're not told, oh, this is a tunnel in Berlin. They're just, they know that this is sensitive information, that they don't know quite how it's being captured. But these are 2 of the Soviet officers whose communications are being intercepted. Yevgeny Petrovranov, who was the KGB chief in Berlin, the Karlshorst, where the KGB was headquartered. And then Marshal Andrei Grechko, who was the 5-star commander of the group of Soviet forces in Germany. He doesn't know that his lines are tapped either. And it's really a gold mine that the Americans and the British are capturing here. Now, of course, I did mention that that George Blake had learned about the tunnel from before even the first spadeful of dirt had been dug. And nonetheless, the KGB, as I describe, opted to protect Blake rather than protect the Red Army. Essentially, the feeling was that Blake was proving to be such a valuable spy that if they did anything to block the tunnel, Blake was one of only a handful of people who knew about it. He would have been exposed almost immediately as the source of a leak about this tunnel. So the KGB lets this tunnel operate for almost a full year before they decide to orchestrate a discovery that was done very carefully. They waited until heavy rains to actually send a team out looking for short circuits, which were actually occurring. But they managed to send a team to the right location to find the tunnel. And this becomes just a huge international sensation. This was like the biggest spy story of the day, that the Americans had been caught with this tunnel into a quarter mile into Soviet territory, into East Berlin there, and the international press was all called in. As I mentioned, Blake, who just died a few months ago, his feeling was that I asked him whether he thought the KGB got the better of the deal, because the Red Army, and in fact the KGB itself, did lose quite a bit of information, and he tried to be modest about it, but he kind of chuckled about it and said, "You'd have to ask them." But I think in the end, both the KGB and the CIA and SIS all got something from the tunnel. The Soviets were able to protect their great spy George Blake, and the Americans and the British actually got a real roadmap into Red Army capabilities, information about their nuclear program, information about their new types of weaponry, tanks, bombers that were being deployed into Poland and Germany. Lots of locations of units that had been heretofore unknown to the West. Also, some of they were also able to tap some of the KGB lines and learned about some of the KGB's own operations. So it was an interesting operation, I think, to say the least. But in any event, I wanted to leave time for questions and all that. So I'll leave it at that. See if I can figure out how to end the slides. Here we go, I think. Is that it?
Yeah, and if you just click stop sharing screen, it'll close it out for you.
Yeah, let me see if I can get to that. Yeah, like I say, my I'm not seeing that for some reason. If I can, I'll click around and try to oh, here we go.
Here, I think I was able to.
Yeah, great. Okay.
So do we have any questions? Feel free to unmute and ask them yourself or send them in the chat and I can read them for you.
Yes, I have a couple questions, Steve. So is it safe to assume, or is there any documentation of deliberate feeding of misinformation in that last year that the Soviets allowed the tunnel to remain? Is part one. And part two is, what was the, if any, retribution, so to speak, by the Soviets after this theatrical presentation of, oh, we just found this tunnel?
Right. Well, those are both really good questions. The disinformation question, that of course, when as I described in the book, when Blake is discovered 5 years later in 1961, he finally comes under suspicion and is arrested. He confesses to the to his interrogators that he had blown the tunnel even before it was built, and this, of course, caused heart attacks in Washington and London, and Bill Harvey just exploded at the news. And there was a lot of feeling that, well, then, this information must have been all compromised. At least that was, some of the initial fears. And what happened though was that, as Hugh Montgomery, who was involved in this investigation, put it, the problem was if they started putting disinformation into the channel of information that was being captured by the Americans and the British, it would have stuck out like a sore thumb. Essentially, because of the volume of conversations that were being recorded, and we're talking, 1,000 plus a day. I think some 400,000 over the course of the operation. If you try sticking in, some disinformation, it's going to be immediately contradicted by all the other calls that are actually legitimate. You can't have like the thousands and thousands of people who are using these phone lines, which is essentially everybody in the Soviet army and in Germany, and have them as part of this this disinformation campaign, because that would have backfired in a hurry. That that would have certainly led to Blake being discovered. And this was also Blake's feeling. He said he would have been he probably would have been outed almost immediately if they tried to put in disinformation. And nonetheless, both CIA and SIS, conducted major investigations, and they were never able to find a single piece of information that they could point to as disinformation. Blake's handler, Sergei Kondrashov, says the same thing. He wrote an account about his experiences overseeing a major part of Soviet intelligence, counterintelligence, including his handling of Blake. And he said that they didn't want to put in disinformation for that reason. So, and part of that was because it was the Red Army's lines that were being compromised. So they gave the Soviet high command sort of vague warnings about telephone security that, you might want to watch your security. And Ivan Serov, who was head of the KGB, passed on this warning to his defense ministry counterpart. But it just didn't do a whole lot of good. There was all kinds of security violations. So you'd have general officers speaking on these lines without using the proper codes, as well as logistical clerks, and all sorts of information was out that way. So that's a long way of saying that no, the best estimate of the CIA, the SIS, and the Soviets themselves from their what they say, and Blake as well, is that there was no disinformation. The reaction to this discovery was pretty remarkable, because the Soviets were hoping, and Nikita Khrushchev, who was emerging as the main successor to Stalin at that time. They'd had sort of a triumvirate for a bit, but Khrushchev was sort of being recognized now as number one. And he was trying to come up with some propaganda wins against the West. And his thinking was that he could use the tunnel as a cudgel against the West, because the Americans were always talking about holding this moral high ground. They were defending freedom and so on and so forth. But here was this tunnel violating East German territory. He was using this to claim that Berlin was a nest of spies, which it was. Berlin was like the #1 nest of spies in the world at this point. There were so many spies. There was, by some estimates, 10,000 spies from the Americans, Soviets, Czechs, Poles, you name it. Everybody had their spies and agents and goons and so forth. But he wanted to use this as a way to force the Americans out of Berlin. And he was expecting to get a great press from this. But what happened instead was that, by and large, the reaction in the West was quite favorable to the Americans. it was like people were kind of amazed that the CIA had actually been able to pull a fast one on the Soviets, because up to that point there wasn't really much of a track record of doing that. And so there were all these stories in the West about, boy, the CIA is finally getting its act together. And Berliners themselves, there was a lot of staged outrage, but most East Berliners, because the tunnel itself became a tourist attraction at this point, they marched thousands of people through every day to view this this site of American imperialism. But there was kind of this grudging admiration for what the Brits and the Americans had pulled off. So that aspect of it kind of backfired on the Soviets.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did Harvey and Blake work together? If they did, how come Harvey didn't sniff him out?
That's a great question. They did meet a couple of times at tunnel. There was every now and then they would meet, generally either in Frankfurt or London. And there was the meeting where Blake was actually taking notes about the tunnel. And Harvey, he didn't like the Brits in general. Peter Lunn, the SIS station chief, was sort of an exception to the rule. But Harvey didn't have enough interaction with Blake to sniff him out. But Blake was also very good at what he did. Nobody really had any inkling of what he was doing. Certainly not Peter Lunn or any of his colleagues. Blake was a very self-effacing, very he had a very dry sense of humor, and was good at getting along with people. Most people liked him. He didn't develop close friendships, but he was popular with his colleagues. And so no, there weren't any signals that Harvey picked up. Although when he learned that Blake had been a spy, he was like, he just erupted, and he remembered Blake, and he was like, he definitely did not have was not happy to learn that. And Blake, for his part, thought of Bill Harvey as a cowboy. I mean, he just described him as this. Blake didn't particularly like Americans to start with, and he thought of them as sort of Wild West types. And Harvey definitely sort of filled that stereotype very nicely. So it would have been fun to have a camera watching the two of them interact, because Harvey was like a bull in a china shop, and Blake was a very delicate, debonair guy, and it would have been fun to see. According, Peter Montignon, who was a friend of both of them and was at some of these meetings, had some pretty funny descriptions of how that all happened. But yeah, Blake was not suspected at the time.
Well, what gave the Soviets the idea that Blake was going to be such a valuable asset that they were willing to give up all this years worth of intelligence to shield him?
Well, yeah, that's another good question. Well, part of it was what he had already produced. He had, while in North Korea, he'd met with KGB officers who came to the North Korean camp up near the Yalu River where he's being held, and they brought in some of the real specialists who had worked with Philby, and the information that Blake gave them in North Korea all checked out. So they were quite suspicious of him at first. What, this guy is just going to volunteer to work for us? But he passed these various checks. Were they able to check the information he got from other sources, including what they received from Philby and others. Also, once Blake is back, it's clear that his superiors think highly of him, because the fact that he's put in this very sensitive office that is overseeing the tunnel is an indication of that the British think highly of him, which the Soviets were sort of surprised at, because if one of their officers had come back from 3 years of captivity, in a South Korean prisoner of war camp, they very likely would not have put him in a sensitive position. But the British weren't very good at vetting their own officers. They tended to think of their officers as above reproach, essentially. So There was really only a cursory vetting done of him. So basically, the Soviets, by virtue of what Blake was giving them, which included, by the way, the first information that the Soviets received about the Vienna tunnels came from Blake as well. They hadn't known anything about that. And Blake is giving them these actual highly secret reports, sort of reports that only 6 copies are being made, one for London, one for Washington. But one of them is going to Moscow thanks to Blake. And that information is all checking out. So by this point, Philby is not, is no longer can serve for them because he's come under suspicion, and they were desperate for a new guy. And Sergei Kondrashov, who handled Blake, said that they had visions of Blake perhaps rising to the top, possibly being sent to Moscow or working in Washington, which would also give him access to some great information. So he did show a lot of signs of being a star. And when Blake was assigned to Berlin, actually as the tunnel operation is underway, and the Soviets actually wanted to make sure that the British kept on thinking highly of him. So they gave him a source to develop that he was able to impress his British bosses with. So it was pretty effective.
And what finally tripped him up? Blake?
Another spy. There was a Polish military intelligence officer who began giving information to the CIA in Warsaw that pointed to a high-level source in British intelligence. And this guy Golanevsky eventually defected in Berlin to the Americans, and he had given them all this information. The CIA had passed it on to the British. The British had conducted an investigation, but there was he gave them evidence that a British document that only maybe 10 or so officers in British intelligence would have had access to, including George Blake, was in the hands of the KGB. So that's a pretty good indication that there's a high-level source. And they did investigate Blake at that point, but they thought him, above reproach again. And so they missed it the first time. But after Golanevsky defected and he began saying, what, you haven't found the source? You guys are pathetic. And so they began looking at it again. And this time, new eyes, there was a very effective British counterintelligence guy named Shergood, who began suspecting that Blake was the man. And Blake at the time was in Beirut learning Arabic for a future assignment. And they lured Blake back from Beirut and pretty much ambushed him with questioning. And that's when they learned the bitter truth.
Do we have any more questions?
Steve, this is Bill McDonald. Last time I saw you, we were riding the MARC train together a number of years ago.
Okay, yeah. I thought I recognized.
Yeah, and I thoroughly enjoyed one of your other books, Through the Perilous Fight. I think that came out when we were riding together. One of the things that I was super impressed with here is all of the direct quotes that you have in the book. Can you say something about the process that you used to get all those direct quotes from people who were actually involved?
Yeah, no, it was, first of all, I was really lucky that I started this project just in time because there were a number of folks who were still, a surprising number of folks who were involved with the tunnel who were still alive and aren't now. Blake, of course, being one, Hugh Montgomery, both of the Corps of Engineer officers who oversaw the digging, others like Oleg Kalugin, who was another one of Blake's handlers. He's alive and living in Rockville. In fact, I just spoke to him today. But so there was that, as a firsthand source to start with. Then, some of it came from memorandum. Some of this has been released through Freedom of Information requests that I made with the CIA. others had been compiled by CIA historians. They had this great volume of Berlin Cold War documents that has, like, for example, a lot of memos that Bill Harvey himself wrote. There was also an American officer in Berlin who worked under Harvey, who wrote a biography of Harvey called, gosh, why am I blanking on the name? A Flawed Patriot. It's right up here on my shelf. But he did a lot of interviews with his fellow officers. This is when he was working on the book in the 90s, and he kept all those recordings of interviews with people, and then he gave them to the library, the University of California, Santa Barbara. So there are transcripts of all these interviews out there. And you have memoirs and recollections that were written by some of the Germans involved, British, Americans. I did research at the Stasi archives in Berlin, which the Stasi, of course, was the East German security service. And Blake, after he, by the way, I don't want to give it away, but Blake did escape, of course, from prison in London and make his way back to Moscow. But he would be brought back to Berlin from time to time to talk to Stasi officers, and they recorded that. So there were transcripts of his talks to the Stasi in Berlin, where he's talking about the tunnel and other things. What else? Just I was just really surprised. But on the other hand, it was easier to get firsthand accounts in some ways from this book than the Perilous Fight, War of 1812 book. I didn't find too many veterans of that war still around.
That was a marvelous book. I've read it twice. It's really
thank
good.
you. Yeah. So it was, and it also helped, I think, that since my dad had worked at the agency, and a lot of his, some of his friends, were still around, and they were able to point me to people to talk to as well. That was quite helpful. The Eisenhower Library in Abilene, you've got transcripts of things that John Foster Dulles is saying to Allen Dulles or to Eisenhower. I mean, it's just amazing sometimes how much you can find in these libraries.
Yeah, that's an amazing amount of research. Well done.
Thank you very much, Bill. Appreciate it.
Any last questions?
Hi, Steve. It's good to see you, and it's wonderful to hear this again. I saw you in Barnesville, of course, and then got your book and read it. How many years did it take you with the research that you did? And again, I want to reiterate how beautifully written it is.
Well, thanks. I do appreciate that. Let's see. I started the real research. Well, no, actually, I started in 2014. I went to the CIA history conference up at Carlisle, and there are a number of topics, most of them Cold War related. I think actually all of them. And just there was one presentation by the CIA officer about the Berlin Tunnel. And of course, I'd heard of the tunnel. I knew a little bit about it, but I was really intrigued. And this guy was saying, it's like there's a lot about this, this tunnel that hasn't come out. And so I kind of followed up with him about that and got some good leads. And so that was in 2014, but I didn't really start full-time working on it till the following year, 2015. And that's when I, went to London and to Berlin and Moscow, and as well as, just around here, at the National Archives or out to Abilene. So let's see, I pretty much was hard at work on the research for a good 2 years. And then once I started writing, you still are sometimes doing research, even though you shouldn't, because you got to get the darn thing done. But you kind of keep on thinking of other questions you want to ask. So I'd call up Hugh Montgomery or someone and I'd find some other document, or like a freedom of information request from the CIA would finally be answered 2 years later, and then, you know, it's like, oh my gosh, here's some more things to use. So it kind of, the research almost continued to the day of publication, practically in 2019.
Very
Wow.
impressive.
Thanks.
I can't wait to read it.
So Steve, does any part of the tunnel exist today?
Yeah, I mean, well, the Spy Museum, in fact, in its new location, I'm sure most of you haven't had a chance to go there since it's been closed most of the time since they moved to L'Enfant Plaza. They actually have this this section of tunnel that had been discovered around the time I was doing my research in Germany. What had happened was after the wall came down, some of the pieces of the tunnel had been dug up on the western side because they were digging Autobahn to connect, you know, the airport, and they pulled up some of the tunnel at that point, you know, by accident. You know, the workers didn't know what they'd found at first, and there's a piece in the Allied Museum in Berlin, but then they assumed by the mid 1990s that there was no more tunnel left. But what had happened was that when the East Germans, they dug up their portion, the part of the tunnel that was on East German territory in 1956, and no one knew what had happened to that, or at least nobody in the West knew. And it was assumed that it had been melted down because this was kind of high grade steel that they'd been using to line the tunnel. But it turns out that the East German Army had cut up sections and sent them out to East German Army units across East Germany to use for different things, for, you know, training, like as command posts. Then some of them, you know, farmers like said, hey, you know, this would actually make a good silo. So there were actually lots of pieces of tunnel that were scattered around East Germany, and I went out to the site where this one guy, he took me out to this forest where he'd been out cutting wood one day, and he'd found a piece of the tunnel that had been abandoned by an East German, you know, it was used by an East German Army engineer unit. And after the wall came down and the East German Army was more or less absorbed by the West, you know, a lot of this stuff was just abandoned. And so he found it out there in the woods. And now that section, well, it wasn't that section, but a similar section that was found at that same time is the section that's now in the Spy Museum. So once things open up, I'd recommend going down there because they have a good exhibit about how the tunnel operated. Of course, if you get to Berlin, the Allied Museum has a terrific exhibit as well.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Very good talk.
Yes, thank you.
No,
Great.
thank you very much. Appreciate it. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, very good.